You wonder, don't you, what would really happen if you quit social media? Not the short burst of detox you've tried before, where you delete an app for a weekend and then reinstall it on Monday morning as if nothing happened. Not the temporary breaks you announce to friends with a dramatic post, only to find yourself scrolling again after a few restless nights. I mean really quit, walking away not for a pause but for good. What would that do to you? You imagine the silence first. The way your phone would stop vibrating with its endless little jolts, as though the world itself had been tapping you on the shoulder 100 times a day. You imagine mornings that unfold without that first reach for the screen, without the tiny lottery of likes and notifications. Perhaps at first it feels clean, pure, like stepping into a room where all the noise has been turned off at once. But then the questions creep in. Would you become free, or would you simply vanish? Would you grow closer to your own thoughts or drift further from the lives of others? Would you find yourself or lose yourself? That's the tension behind this question, because deep down you already know how deeply stitched these networks have become into the fabric of your days. They are no longer just apps on a screen. They are habits, architectures of attention, mirrors of your identity. They are where birthdays live, where memories surface, where people speak into the void and wait for an answer. And you know this too, you didn't exactly choose them, not fully. You fell into them like the rest of us, step by step. A friend invited you, a workplace demanded it, a moment of boredom opened the door, and slowly, without any dramatic vow, you found yourself woven into their fabric. Years passed, your sense of connection became filtered through them, and the question of quitting began to feel less like a choice and more like tearing yourself away from a limb you no longer remember growing. So what really happens when you stop? Will your brain repair itself like a muscle unburdened from constant twitching? Will you sleep better, think more clearly, feel time return to its slower rhythm? Or will you ache, restless and lonely, peering at the empty silence of a life no longer tethered to the digital crowd? What happens to friendships that once relied on the daily thread of comments and updates? Do they wither in the silence, or deepen when forced into more deliberate contact? What happens to your memory when you stop outsourcing it to photographs and timelines? What happens to your attention when no one is competing to steal it? These questions hang in the air like static. They pull you forward deeper because you know the answer can't be simple. It can't be only good or only bad. There must be something more complicated waiting inside this experiment. And maybe you've felt it already in flashes. The way a walk feels different when your phone is left at home. The way boredom stretches, uncomfortable at first, then strangely fertile. The way silence can unearth thoughts you didn't know were still living inside you. Or perhaps you felt the opposite, that absence creates a shadow. That disconnection feels less like freedom and more like exile. That stepping away means being forgotten, invisible, irrelevant in a world that never slows down to wait. The question is not just what happens to you. It is what happens to the world inside your mind when the constant stream is dammed and you are left with yourself again. And so you sit with this tension, the possibility of clarity, the risk of isolation, the dream of freedom, the fear of disappearance. What happens when you quit social media? That's where we begin. You picture the moment it happens, the quiet, unremarkable day when you press the button. Delete, log out, vanish, no fireworks, no ceremony, just a simple act of absence. One click and suddenly the world you carried in your pocket, millions of voices, thousands of images, the constant drip of other people's lives stops flowing. At first it feels like something is missing, though you can't quite say what. Like walking into your home and noticing a piece of furniture has been taken away. You can't name it instantly, but the space feels wrong. The silence isn't silence yet, it's a buzzing awareness of the thing that isn't there. You reach for your phone automatically, not out of desire but out of muscle memory. Your hand knows the shape. Your thumb remembers the path, unlock, swipe, tap, scroll, but the motion collapses midair. There is nothing to tap, no infinite feed waiting, only a blank space where once the world seemed endless. You realize then how deeply embedded it was. These small gestures, the restless flick of your thumb, the ritual of checking even when nothing new is expected. Like a smoker's hand, reaching unconsciously for a cigarette not because of craving but because of habit. You start to wonder, Was it really you making those choices, or was it simply a body running a script written by someone else? This is the first broken intuition, the idea that you were in control, that you dipped into social media out of conscious decision, out of free will, that you scrolled because you wanted to, because you enjoyed it. But here in the vacuum of absence, you see the truth more clearly. Much of it was automatic, reflex, a habit so ingrained that the decision itself had long since slipped beneath the surface. And in this recognition, a thought sharpens. Maybe quitting is not about fighting desire, but about facing programming. You begin to notice how many moments were once filled with the fade, waiting in line at the store, standing by the kettle while water boiled, sitting in a quiet room before a meeting began. Those tiny pockets of emptiness, once invitations for thought or for stillness, had been colonized by the infinite scroll, and without it the empty pockets return. They open like small windows. At first they feel awkward. The silence is heavy, like an empty stage. You don't know what to do with your hands, your mind. You feel restless. Your thoughts scurry like animals startled into the light. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something changes. The silence becomes less frightening. The empty windows become space again. Space for boredom, yes, but boredom with a strange weight. Boredom that carries the seed of new thoughts. The kind of boredom that once led to drawing doodles in notebooks, to staring at clouds, to hearing your own mind wander into unexpected territory. And you realize boredom is not an enemy, it is a doorway. This is where the evidence begins to build. Studies have shown that when people allow themselves to be bored, creativity stirs. The mind, deprived of constant stimulation, begins to generate its own. Ideas surface, memories reconfigure. Connections are made that would otherwise be drowned out by noise. You start to test this on yourself. Without a feed to scroll, you find yourself daydreaming again. Thoughts drift without a shepherd, sometimes aimless, sometimes startling. An old memory rises up from nowhere, the color of your childhood bedroom wall, the smell of rain on a hot driveway. Then, without warning, you are imagining something new. A story, an idea, a possibility you had not touched in years. Is this what was stolen all along? Not just time, but the quiet soil in which imagination grows. But the loss, too, is undeniable. You sense it most sharply in the evenings. That familiar rhythm, dinner, then a flicker of boredom, then the reach for the feed. Gone, now the night stretches open, heavier, slower. You feel both freed and abandoned. You begin to notice the world is moving without you. Friends are posting, sharing, laughing in a space you no longer occupy. Inside, jokes you will not see, photos you will not like, news you will not absorb in the first rush of comments. You are still here in your body, in your home, but a whole dimension of presence has dissolved. And this is the paradox. At the same moment you gain space, you lose a world. At the same moment you reclaim your time, you feel the ghost of disconnection. So you ask yourself again, is this freedom or is this exile? The truth flickers between the two. Some days it feels like one, some days the other. Some mornings you wake lighter, more awake, more yourself. Some nights you lie restless, feeling the edges of invisibility press against you. And yet, even in that tension, you begin to sense something new emerging, a slower pace of thought, a gentler rhythm of attention, the way a walk feels when you are not pulling a device from your pocket every few steps, the way conversations feel when you are not glancing down at invisible interruptions. Life begins to unfold in longer stretches, uninterrupted, and with it comes a subtle shock. How much of your life had been punctured, fragmented, divided into smaller and smaller shards. Without the constant checking, time itself feels different. You notice more details in a day, the sound of footsteps on the sidewalk, the small inflections in a friend's voice, the way the light shifts across your desk as the afternoon deepens. These details, once swallowed by distraction, return with surprising weight. They are not spectacular, they are not dramatic, but they are real, they anchor you. And here lies another broken intuition, the assumption that social media connects you more deeply to life. In truth, perhaps it skims the surface, fast, constant, glittering, and what it leaves behind is a quieter, slower depth. Still, you are not yet sure. You feel both the hunger and the healing. You feel both the loss and the liberation. And the experiment has only just begun. So you lie down at night, your phone no longer glowing beside you, and you ask the question again, in a whisper only you can hear, what really happens when you quit social media? The answer is still unfold. First week feels like standing at the edge of a forest. The path ahead is unclear, shaded by branches, but you know the only way through is forward. And as you walk into this new terrain, days without feeds, nights without scrolling, you begin to notice how your mind, your body, your moods are responding. The evidence arrives quietly, not in fireworks, but in shifts so subtle they almost escape notice. First is sleep. Without the endless glow of a screen humming with updates, your nights stretch longer, deeper. You fall asleep faster. Your dreams return, strange, vivid, sometimes unsettling, sometimes beautiful. Dreams you once thought you had lost, as though the constant stream of input had crowded them out. Scientists have measured this, of course. Exposure to bright blue light before bed disrupts melatonin production, delaying the natural signal that tells your body it's time to rest. And it isn't only the light, it's the stimulation, the endless stream of novelty, the emotional spikes of outrage, amusement, envy, desire. Each scroll pulls your brain into alertness, a jolt of adrenaline that fights against rest. By stepping away, even for a week, you feel the reversal. Your body reclaims its rhythm. The second shift comes in attention. In the past, you would sit to read an article or a book, only to find your focus fragmenting after a few minutes. Your hand would twitch toward your phone as though expecting a reward. You thought this was simply the way things were now, attention forever shortened, forever restless. But after days without the feed, you find that your focus begins to lengthen again. You read a chapter without interruption. You write a page without drifting. You sit through silence without the itch to fill it. And this, too, has its explanation. Psychologists describe it as the variable reward system, the same principle that governs slot machines. You pull the lever and sometimes you win, sometimes you don't. That unpredictability keeps you hooked, chasing the next hit. Social media is built on the same design. Each scroll may bring something delightful, something enraging, something dull. The uncertainty itself is addictive. But when you quit, when you stop pulling the lever, your brain begins to calm. The constant search for the next hit fades. Focus, once fractured, begins to knit itself back together. There is also the matter of memory. You may not notice it instantly, but gradually you realize that without a feed curating memories for you, your own recall sharpens. You remember small things you had stopped attending to. The joke someone told yesterday, the smell of dinner last night, the way a certain street corner looked in the light of afternoon. Before, you relied on external reminders, photos, posts, resurfaced anniversaries. Now your mind itself begins to store more, to hold more. It is as if the muscle of remembering has been forced to exercise again. And the science agrees. When we offload memory onto devices, our brains adapt by remembering less. Psychologists call it the Google effect or digital amnesia. If you know a piece of information will be stored somewhere else, you are less likely to retain it yourself. Social media amplifies this, presenting your past back to you in neat, curated packages. Birthdays, memories from this day 5 years ago, photos you once posted. And in relying on it, your own memory weakens. By stepping away, you allow that function to regrow. But perhaps the most striking change is emotional. At first, you feel restless, even lonely. The quiet hum of validation is gone, the likes, the comments, the replies that tell you exist in the minds of others. But after a while, something unexpected surfaces, a calmer baseline. Your emotions fluctuate less wildly. The highs are gentler, but the lows are gentler too. Why? Because without the constant stream of comparison, the mirror you are held against every moment begins to fade. No longer do you scroll past the vacations, the perfect meals, the filtered faces. No longer do you measure yourself against 1,000 curated lives. You are left with your own, smaller, quieter perhaps, but more stable. This too is supported by research. Studies show that heavy social media use is linked to higher rates of anxiety, depression, and dissatisfaction, particularly among younger people. The reason is not simply time spent, but the nature of the comparison it fosters. On social media, you compare your unedited life to the highlight reels of others. The gap grows, the dissatisfaction festers. When you quit, that mirror cracks, the comparison weakens. You begin to live more within your own scale. And with that comes another subtle shift, gratitude. You find yourself noticing the ordinary in a way that feels fuller. The warmth of a mug in your hands, the sound of leaves in the evening wind, The quiet satisfaction of completing a task with no one watching, no one liking, no one validating. It is just yours. The evidence stacks higher the longer you go. Sleep, focus, memory, emotion, gratitude, piece by piece your life begins to feel different, not transformed into some utopia but recalibrated closer to balance. And yet another question rises, whispering through the calm. If this is so clearly beneficial, if the science supports it, why does it feel so impossible to step away? Why do so many of us return, even after tasting this clarity? That is the next knot to untangle, because the pull is not just personal. It is not just habit, not just dopamine. It is cultural, social, structural. These platforms are not neutral tools easily set aside. They are embedded into the fabric of how we communicate, how we belong, how we imagine ourselves in relation to others. To quit is not only to alter your brain chemistry, it is to step against the tide of the age itself. And so the evidence, as compelling as it is, cannot stand alone. For if quitting were only a matter of health and well-being, more people would do it. The deeper truth is that something else holds us there, something more complicated than addiction, something more entangled than mere habit. That truth waits in the next step. But for now, as you drift through another night without scrolling, you hold on to the fragments of what you've seen, the small but undeniable shifts, the sleep, the focus, the memory, the mood, the way life feels less scattered, more textured, the way you feel more present inside your own skin. The experiment continues, and somewhere in the quiet, you hear the question echo again, though softer now, less frantic, more patient. What happens when you quit social media? The answers are only beginning. The honeymoon does not last forever. At first, the silence feels clean. The rhythms of sleep and focus return. You sense the benefits blooming quietly like small shoots in spring. But as the days stretch into weeks, the cracks begin to show. You notice the ways in which absence is not only freedom but loss. The first loss is subtle. It arrives in moments when you realize you are out of step with the cultural rhythm. A friend references a meme, a joke, a story that has swept across the feeds in the last few days. Everyone else laughs, nods, shares in the familiarity. You smile politely, but the reference slides past you. You are no longer fluent in the language of now. The second loss arrives sharper. A birthday passes unmarked. You did not see the reminder. You did not see the flood of posts. You realize that many of your gestures of care, the small likes, the comments, the digital acknowledgements were carried by those platforms. Without them, you feel clumsier, less connected. To keep up now requires effort, deliberate planning. The easy flow of social maintenance has dried up. And then, perhaps the most painful, loneliness. Not the kind that comes from being physically alone, but the subtler ache of invisibility. Before you posted something and felt the small hum of recognition. A handful of likes, a brief exchange, a ripple that confirmed your existence in the eyes of others. Now the ripples vanish. Your days are lived without that echo. Your joys, your frustrations, your insights, shared only with those immediately near you or not shared at all. The silence grows heavier. You begin to wonder, am I disappearing? It is not only imagination. The world, it seems, does move on without you. The digital crowd is a river, and once you step out, the water does not pause, it rushes forward. You are left on the bank, watching from a distance, your feet dry but your connection thinning. And here lies one of the hardest truths. Social media is not merely distraction. It is infrastructure. It is where events are organized, where communities form, where news breaks, where art circulates. To quit is not only to avoid the noise, it is to lose access to the commons. You begin to feel the cost of exile. Think of professional life. Job postings, networking, collaborations, all increasingly flow through these channels. To step away is to risk invisibility in the marketplace, to miss opportunities that never make it to email or print. You may find yourself less reachable, less connected, less relevant. Think of friendships. In the past, relationships were maintained through letters, calls, in-person visits. But in the digital age, the small drip of updates, the photo, the status, the casual message becomes the glue that keeps distance bearable. Without it, distance expands. Friends in other cities slip further away. Without the daily micro-interactions, the thread grows thinner until eventually it breaks. And think of identity itself. In many ways, your online self has become an extension of your existence. It is where you express, archive, remember. Without it, you feel a gap. Who are you when you are not reflected through that lens? Who are you when you are not seen? The counter case is not only psychological but practical. Society itself has shifted to depend on these networks. To opt out is to carry the burden of adaptation. You must find other ways to stay informed, other ways to maintain bonds, other ways to express. And these ways, though richer in some respects, require more effort, more intention, more vulnerability. You begin to ask yourself, was social media not only a trap but also a crutch? Did it not only fragment your attention but also hold your world together in invisible threads? The science again has its say. Researchers find that social media can genuinely increase feelings of belonging, particularly for those who feel isolated in their physical environments. Communities form across borders, support groups gather across distances. For marginalized voices, platforms can provide visibility otherwise denied. For movements, they serve as megaphones. For individuals, they serve as lifelines. When you step away, you lose this. You feel the edges of isolation more kindly. You may gain depth, yes, but you lose reach. And then comes another realization. You are not only quitting a habit, you are stepping against the tide of how humanity now organizes itself. You feel it when a friend invites you to an event through a Facebook group. You feel it when news spreads first on Twitter before it appears anywhere else. You feel it when a conversation unfolds entirely in comment threads that you no longer see. You feel it most when someone says, "Did you hear?" and you have not. It is easy to romanticize absence, to imagine that stepping away is a return to authenticity, to real life, to what matters. But the counter case whispers insistently, absence can also mean irrelevance, silence can also mean solitude, freedom can also mean exile. And so the paradox deepens. On one hand, you feel clearer, calmer, more grounded. On the other, you feel lonelier, slower, slightly unmoored from the pace of the world. The evidence of benefit clashes with the evidence of loss. Neither cancels the other. Both coexist, pulling you in opposite directions. You begin to sense that the question is not as simple as good or bad. It is not a matter of declaring victory or failure. The truth lies somewhere murkier, harder, in the tension itself. Because in the end, quitting social media is not merely a personal choice. It is a cultural act. To step away is to position yourself differently in relation to the collective. It is to say, I will live at a different tempo even if the world moves faster. It is to say, I will speak in different spaces even if they are smaller. It is to say, I will risk being unseen in order to be more fully here. But this risk is real. And the ache of it, the ache of being absent from the currents where so much of life now flows, cannot be ignored. So you sit with this ache. You let it expand in your chest, not as something to be solved, but as something to be understood. You begin to see that quitting is not a clean escape. It is a trade. You exchange one set of burdens for another. You shed one kind of noise, but inherit one kind of silence. And the silence, though heavy, may carry its own lessons. You close your eyes at night, the phone still dark beside you, and the thought returns. What happens when you quit social media? The answer is not one thing, it is many things at once. And the contradictions are not a problem to be solved. They are the truth to be lived. You wake one morning and realize the experiment has matured. It is no longer about the novelty of absence. It is no longer about the first waves of withdrawal or the early flush of clarity. Now the absence has settled into the texture of your life. It is no longer something you are doing, it is simply the way things are. And this brings a deeper realization. Quitting social media is not an act, it is an identity. It is not only about what you avoid, it is about how you now live, how you now see yourself in relation to others. It is about the new rhythms you inhabit, the new trade-offs you carry, the new conversations you enter or leave behind. You begin to see the two truths clearly, side by side. On one side, the clarity. The longer you remain off the feed, the more you notice how your thoughts stretch again like muscles long unused. You read more deeply, you listen more fully, you notice details once blurred by constant distraction. Your sense of time returns to a slower rhythm where days feel full, not fractured. You are less tethered to the judgments of others, less thrown by the constant mirror of comparison. Your emotions move in longer waves, steadier, less jagged. On the other side, the exile, you miss things, you miss the pulse of the collective, you miss the easy companionship of likes and comments, the shorthand of memes, the sense of being woven into the daily chatter of friends and strangers alike. You feel the quiet weight of invisibility. The world rushes by and you are not part of its first conversation. You hear echoes, not live voices. And so you stand in the middle, both freer and lonelier, both more yourself and less connected, both calmer and more detached. This tension is not temporary. It is the permanent condition of quitting. It is the paradox you carry, not to be solved, but to be lived with. You realize then that the question is not whether quitting is good or bad. The question is what kind of life you want to inhabit, what trade-offs you are willing to accept. Think of it as choosing an environment. On one side, the crowded plaza bustling with voices filled with excitement, chaos, novelty, connection. On the other side, the quiet garden, slower, more solitary, where growth happens unseen, where silence is the soil. Both have beauty, both have cost. Neither can be lived in fully without losing the other. And this, perhaps, is the deeper truth. Social media is not simply a tool to be picked up or put down. It is a world. To leave it is not to detox. It is to emigrate. It is to live in a different country with its own language, its own rhythms, its own silences. You begin to see how strange it is that so much of your life once flowed through invisible wires. The jokes, the arguments, the memories, the photos, the affirmations, all passing through a handful of corporations, their servers humming in distant warehouses. You begin to sense how fragile it all is, how artificial, how designed. And in that awareness, another kind of clarity arrives. Leaving is not only personal, it is also political. Because these platforms are not neutral mirrors, they are systems engineered to keep you there, to profit from your attention, your data, your clicks, to manipulate desire, outrage, loneliness, curiosity. When you step away, you see the machinery more clearly. You feel the absence of its pull. You begin to realize how much of your energy was spent inside someone else's architecture, and this realization softens the loneliness a little. Because invisibility, though heavy, also frees you from being a product. Your attention is no longer for sale. Your identity is no longer curated by algorithms. Your memory is no longer outsourced to a timeline. You are harder to categorize, harder to track, harder to predict. There is power in this, even if it comes quietly. Still, the ache remains. You walk into a room and hear laughter about something that has swept the feeds. You do not know it. You are out of rhythm. You must decide whether to re-enter the current or to remain on the bank. Some days you wade back in through borrowed glimpses, a headline, a forwarded screenshot, a friend's retelling, but you no longer live there. You are a visitor now. And so you live in this dual state, a little freer, a little lonelier, a little clearer, a little detached. The paradox continues. But something unexpected begins to grow in that paradox: intimacy. Without the constant drip of digital updates, the relationships you maintain take on a different shape. They are fewer, but they are deeper. A call lasts an hour, not a comment that lasts a second. A meeting in person carries weight because it is no longer supplemented by daily online fragments. Conversations stretch longer, stumble into silences, wander into unexpected places. Friendships grow slower but stronger. You notice, too, the intimacy with yourself. Without the constant chorus of voices, your inner voice grows louder. At first it is restless, even anxious, but over time it grows clearer. You hear your own thoughts more distinctly. You spend more time with your own company. You begin to remember what it feels like to be enough without being seen. This intimacy is not always comfortable. Sometimes it feels like staring too long in a mirror. You see your boredom, your restlessness, your loneliness, your flaws, but you also see your creativity, your resilience, your capacity for quiet joy. Without the noise, the full spectrum returns. And here lies the synthesis. Quitting social media is neither escape nor exile. It is both. It is neither cure nor curse. It is both. It strips away noise and it strips away connection. It heals some wounds and it opens others. It is not a solution, it is a different condition of being. What emerges is not an answer, but a new kind of question. How do you want to live? With the plaza or with the garden? With the feed or with the silence? With the river or with the bank? You realize there is no universal solution. For some, quitting may bring clarity that outweighs the loneliness. For others, the loss of connection is too heavy, the exile too sharp. The choice is not between good and bad. It is between different shapes of life, each with its own texture, its own sacrifices, its own rewards. And perhaps the real work is not to declare one superior, but to see clearly the trade-offs and to choose deliberately. As you lie down at night, the phone still dark, you let the thought echo one more time. What happens when we quit social media? The answer is not a destination. The answer is the path itself, winding between silence and connection, solitude and presence, freedom and exile. And you walk it step by step, not toward resolution, but toward awareness. You start to notice something else, something you hadn't expected at the beginning of this journey. The way quitting social media doesn't just change you. It changes how you relate to other people and how they relate to you. Because quitting isn't only a private act, it ripples outward. Every absence has consequences. Every silence is heard by someone. And those around you, whether they admit it or not, feel the shift. For some, your absence feels like rejection. They notice you no longer like their photos, no longer comment on their updates, no longer reply with the casual affirmation that once kept the thread alive. They may not call you, they may not ask why, but they feel it, the withdrawal of your presence. For others, your absence sparks curiosity. They ask quietly in a message or in person, "Did you delete your account?" And when you say yes, there's a flicker in their eyes, a mix of admiration and disbelief, as if you've stepped outside a system they can't imagine leaving. Some will tell you they've thought about doing the same. Few will follow, but your choice plants a seed, an unsettling reminder that this life inside the feed is not inevitable. And then there are those who don't notice at all, because in the crowded plaza, one absence is quickly filled by another presence. The current moves on, the scroll is endless, and you are reminded again of the truth. In a world of infinite content, no single person is irreplaceable. This realization stings, but it also humbles. You begin to see patterns. Different people carry different weights when they quit. Take the artist. For them, social media is a gallery, a stage, a megaphone. It is how their work finds an audience. To leave it is not only to step into silence, it is to risk invisibility in the very craft they depend on. For some, this exile is unbearable. For others, it is liberation, a chance to create without the constant gaze, to make art that is not algorithm-friendly but soul-deep. Take the activist. For them, social media is not distraction, it is infrastructure. It is where movements are born, where protests are organized, where voices amplify. To leave it is to lose reach, to cut themselves off from the collective surge. Some find other channels, slower but deeper, community meetings, print radio, local gatherings. Others remain tethered by necessity, knowing that without the platform their cause would flicker and dim. Take the teenager. For them, social media is not optional, it is the social fabric itself. It is how friendships form, how belonging is measured, how identity takes shape. To quit is not only exile, it is social death. The silence is too heavy, the distance too wide. For most, the cost is too high. And so they stay, even knowing the harm, because the alternative feels worse. And then take the elder. For them, social media is connection to children, to grandchildren, to lives scattered across geography. It is the window through which they glimpse birthdays, holidays, everyday moments they would otherwise miss. To quit is to close that window, and yet some find peace in returning to letters, calls, visits. Others find the silence unbearable and return, even if only as quiet watchers. You see then that quitting is not one story, it is many. Its meaning shifts depending on who you are, where you stand, what you need, what you fear. The garden is not always better than the plaza. The plaza is not always louder than the garden. The truth lies in the context, and so you begin to understand. The question is not what happens when we quit social media. The question is, what happens when I quit, given the life I live, the needs I carry, the ties I depend on? For you, perhaps the silence feels nourishing. For another, it may feel suffocating. For you, perhaps invisibility feels like freedom. For another, it may feel like erasure. And yet, despite the differences, a common thread emerges. Quitting forces clarity. Whether it brings freedom or exile, whether it heals or isolates, whether it deepens or fragments, it makes visible what was invisible. It shows you the role the platforms played in your life, the ways they shaped memory, attention, relationships, identity. Quitting is a mirror showing you not only what you gain but what you lose. It strips away the illusion that social media was neutral. It reveals its weight, its texture, its presence in your life. And once you have seen this, you cannot unsee it. Even if you return, and many do, you return differently. You scroll with sharper eyes. You notice the hooks, the lures, the manipulations. You know what it costs. You know what it gives. You are less naive. And maybe that is the deeper gift. Not quitting forever, not exile or purity, but perspective. The act of stepping away, even for a time, breaks the illusion. It allows you to choose with clearer eyes. You think of people you know who have left and returned. Some speak of it like a fast, a cleanse. They come back refreshed, less compulsive. Others say the return was painful, the hooks sharper, the noise louder after the silence. Still others never truly returned. They dipped in briefly, then let it go again, drawn back to the garden. You realize that quitting is not a single act but a rhythm. For some, it comes in cycles. On, off, like tides, like seasons. For others, it is permanent. For still others, it is impossible. And you see yourself within this spectrum, neither superior nor inferior to anyone else. Just another human being navigating the strange reality of a world where connection has been digitized, commodified, and embedded in the very fabric of identity. The synthesis deepens. Quitting is not only personal, not only cultural. It is existential. It is about how you define yourself in relation to the collective, about how you balance the hunger for connection with the hunger for peace. And maybe you think the real power is not in choosing once and for all, but in being awake enough to choose at all. Because the greatest trap was never the scrolling itself. The greatest trap was forgetting it was a choice. You lie in bed again, the room quiet, your phone dark. The question circles once more, but softer now, less like a demand and more like a companion. What happens when we quit social media? The answer is no longer about benefits versus costs. It is about balance, about rhythm, about the life you want to build in the space between connection and solitude. And in that space, the next question is already forming. You begin to wonder not only about yourself, but about us, all of us. Because your experiment is personal, yes, but it is also a glimpse into something larger. What does it mean for humanity to build its life inside these platforms? And what does it mean, one by one, to step outside them? You picture a future where nearly everyone remains inside. The plaza grows louder, faster, more crowded. Every thought becomes a post. Every moment becomes a share. Every relationship becomes a thread. The feed accelerates until it is no longer just part of life, it is life. To quit in that future would not be a quiet rebellion. It would be unthinkable, like choosing to stop speaking or refusing to use roads. A refusal not only of distraction, but of existence itself. And you picture the opposite future, one where the platforms collapse under their own weight, where fatigue builds, where the crowd tires of the noise, the manipulation, the endless performance. One where people drift away back into smaller spaces, slower conversations, physical communities. A world where the plaza empties, where the river dries, where the constant hum goes silent. Both futures feel possible. Both futures feel strange. And in the present, you live in the tension between them. Because we are not finished with this experiment as a species. We are in the middle of it. The consequences are still unfolding. The patterns are still forming. We do not yet know what it will mean in the long run to spend decades immersed in the feed. You think of the children being born today, whose first photos appear online before they can walk, before they can speak, whose lives are archived moment by moment before they even understand what it means to be seen. What does it mean to grow up already public, already searchable, already woven into the digital fabric? You think of the elders who remember a world before any of this. For them, the contrast is stark. They know what it means to be unreachable, to wait for a letter, to sit with silence. For them, quitting feels possible because they can remember the texture of life without feeds. But for the young who have never known anything else, what does quitting even mean? Can you step away from something that has always been the air you breathe? And then you think of the planet itself, the energy of servers humming in warehouses, cooling systems working to keep them alive, the electricity that fuels the endless stream of photos, videos, posts, likes, the carbon footprint of the digital world. Quitting in this light becomes not only personal, not only cultural, but ecological, a refusal to feed the machine, a small act of conservation. The open questions multiply. Will social media continue to evolve into something more immersive, more total, drawing us further from the physical into the digital? Or will there be a counter-movement, a return to slowness, to privacy, to depth? Will the next generation be more entangled, or will they be the ones to rebel? Already you see hints of both. Some younger voices flee the mainstream platforms, seeking smaller encrypted spaces, craving privacy. Others embrace new platforms eagerly, spending hours in realms of curated images, endless videos, infinite scrolls. Both impulses live side by side, the hunger for more connection, the hunger for more withdrawal. And you begin to realize, perhaps this is not a problem to be solved. Perhaps this is a condition of being human. We are creatures torn between solitude and connection. We crave both. We fear both. We are restless in silence, yet overwhelmed in noise. Social media, then, is not the cause of this paradox. It is only the amplifier. It magnifies our hunger for attention, our fear of invisibility, our desire for belonging, our need for space. It shows us in sharper relief the contradictions we already carry. And so quitting is not only about leaving a platform, it is about confronting those contradictions in yourself. The need to be seen and the need to be alone. The need to belong and the need to be free. Perhaps that is why it feels so powerful, so unsettling. Because in stepping away, you are not only turning off notifications, you are staring directly into the oldest human questions. Who am I when no one is watching? Who am I when the crowd cannot see me? Do I still exist if I am not reflected back? The answers do not come easily. They are not given in neat lines or tidy studies. They arrive in the quiet hours, in the long stretches of thought, in the sudden pangs of loneliness, in the surprising bursts of clarity. And you realize that your experiment is not just personal data collection. It is a rehearsal for bigger questions. What happens when a society builds its collective memory outside itself? What happens when human attention becomes the most valuable commodity? What happens when presence and absence, visibility and invisibility, connection and solitude are no longer choices made naturally, but engineered, manipulated, sold? These are not questions that end with you. They are questions that will echo for decades, for generations. They are questions that cannot be answered by one person quitting or one person staying. They are questions of culture, of humanity itself. And yet in the middle of them you feel the intimacy of your own choice. Small, quiet, personal. You close your phone at night and the world slows. You walk without scrolling and the air feels sharper. You live in the paradox, carrying both clarity and exile, both freedom and loneliness. Maybe that is enough, not to solve it, not to declare victory or failure, but to live with it awake, to hold the question open like a candle in the dark. What happens when we quit social media? You sense that the answer is not fixed. It will change as the world changes, as you change, as the fabric of connection rewrites itself again and again. The answer is not a conclusion, but a horizon, always visible, never fully reached. And you wonder, perhaps the point is not to arrive. Perhaps the point is to keep asking. Because every time you ask, you remind yourself that this life is not inevitable, that the plaza is not the only place to live, that the garden still exists, waiting. And in that awareness, you feel something stir, not resolution, but freedom. Not certainty, but possibility. The experiment continues, humanity continues, the question continues. And the answer, if it comes at all, will not come in a feed. It will come in how we live, how we connect, how we remember, how we choose. You begin to realize that what you are living through is not an isolated experiment, but part of a much longer story. Because this tension, the pull between noise and silence, between connection and solitude, has appeared before. Each time humanity has invented a new way to speak, to remember, to connect, the same questions have echoed. And perhaps by looking back, you can see more clearly what is happening now. You think first of writing itself. There was a time when memory lived only in bodies, in stories passed mouth to mouth, in songs carried by the breath of elders. When writing appeared, many feared it would weaken memory, destroy the art of oral tradition, hollow out the human mind. Plato himself wrote that writing would create forgetfulness, for people would rely on marks on paper rather than the exercise of their memory. And yet writing endured. It changed humanity, yes. It diminished some skills but expanded others. It created libraries, archives, histories that stretched across centuries. It gave us continuity, precision, the ability to speak across time. It was not good or bad, it was transformation. Then came the printing press. Suddenly, words could be copied cheaply, spread widely, carried across continents. And again the same fears arose. Authorities worried about misinformation, about heresy, about the chaos of too many voices. And indeed, the printing press did bring chaos. Wars of religion, pamphlets of propaganda, waves of confusion. But it also brought literacy, science, revolutions. It made possible the idea of a public, a society bound together by shared texts. Later came the radio, the telephone, the television. Each time the world changed. Each time people worried about attention, about distraction, about the end of conversation. And each time something new was born, connection across distance, a shared sense of culture, a common horizon of experience. And now here we are in the age of social media. It is not the first transformation, it will not be the last. But it feels different, doesn't it? Because this time the scale is unprecedented. Billions of people connected in real time, all speaking, all listening, all performing. Never before has the plaza been so vast, so constant, so inescapable. Never before has the infrastructure of attention been so carefully engineered, so deeply monetized, so intimately entwined with daily life. You realize that quitting social media is not unlike stepping back from the printing press in the 16th century, or refusing to own a radio in the 20th. It is possible, but it means living at the edge of culture, outside the dominant flow. It means choosing slowness when the world is speeding up. And you begin to wonder, will history look back on this age as an awakening or as a fever? Will future generations marvel at the novelty of billions shouting into the void? Or will they see it as the foundation of something deeper, something necessary, something inevitable? No one can know. You are living in the middle of the story, and the middle is always messy. But history does offer a pattern. Each new medium both expands and diminishes. It gives and it takes. Writing gave memory permanence but weakened oral tradition. The press gave literacy but spread propaganda. Television gave shared culture but weakened local community. Social media gives connection but fragments attention. The question then is not whether it is good or bad. The question is what we are willing to trade. And here in your experiment you see the trade more clearly than most. You have tasted the silence. You have felt the clarity, the boredom, the creativity, the loneliness. You have stepped outside, if only for a while, and looked back at the plaza. You know what it costs, you know what it gives. But you also know that history rarely moves backward. Writing did not disappear, printing did not vanish, radio did not collapse. These technologies became part of the fabric of life, even as they evolved, even as they were challenged, even as they changed form. So perhaps social media too will not vanish. Perhaps it will transform, soften, shift into something less extractive, less frantic, less consuming. Or perhaps it will harden, deepen, become more immersive, until the line between digital and physical dissolves entirely. Either way, you know this, humanity will adapt, we always have. But adaptation does not erase the ache. You feel it in yourself, the longing for a slower world, for conversations that unfold without distraction, for memory that lives in bodies, not in servers. You feel nostalgia for a world you only half remember or perhaps never fully knew. A world of pauses, of waiting, of absence not filled by endless noise. And yet at the same time you feel awe at the sheer scale of connection now possible. You can speak to someone across the globe in an instant. You can witness revolutions, disasters, celebrations as they unfold. You can belong to communities that would have been unimaginable in the past. There is wonder here even as there is danger. This duality is not a flaw, it is the essence of human progress. Every invention carries both gift and curse. Every medium both expands and diminishes. Every step forward leaves something behind. And so you realize, quitting social media is not about escaping history. It is about choosing your relationship to it. You are not outside the story, you are part of it. Your absence is part of it. Your silence is part of it. You are not neutral. You are shaping, even in small ways, the direction this story will take. And maybe that is the point, not to decide once and for all whether social media is salvation or ruin, but to live consciously within the paradox, to see it, to name it, to feel it, to refuse to be swept blindly. Because history is not only written by inventors and corporations, it is also written by individuals who choose how to live, how to connect, how to remember. Each absence is a statement, each silence is a voice. And so you ask yourself again, not as an isolated question, but as a historical one. What happens when we quit social media? Perhaps what happens is this: you become a reminder that another way is possible. You become evidence that the plaza is not the only home. You become a witness to the cost, a carrier of memory, a participant in the paradox. You may not change the tide, but you shape your own current, and that in the end is enough. Still, the larger questions linger. What will become of humanity's attention as decades pass in the glow of screens? What will become of memory outsourced to archives we do not control? What will become of connection when it is filtered through algorithms that profit from division, from outrage, from endless hunger? These questions are not yours alone, they belong to all of us, and they remain open, vast, unsolved. You close your eyes and the thought returns. You are living in the middle of the story. The middle is always messy, and the ending has not yet been written. You begin to notice something uncanny. This choice you've made, this decision to step away from the feed, to live without the constant chorus, feels new, radical, almost rebellious. And yet when you look closely, you see that it is not new at all. Humans have been stepping away from the crowd for thousands of years. They did it before social media, before the internet, before electricity. They did it when the plaza was not digital but physical, when noise was not in servers but in marketplaces. Withdrawal is ancient. You think of monks in monasteries, rising before dawn, living in silence, dedicating themselves to prayer, study, meditation. They chose absence too. They chose to turn away from the noise of their societies, the distractions of daily life, the endless chatter of the world. For them, silence was not exile, it was devotion, it was clarity. You think of hermits in the desert, wandering into barren landscapes to live alone with their thoughts. They carried no phones, but their struggle was the same. The restless mind, the temptation to return to the crowd, the loneliness of absence, the raw encounter with themselves. Their solitude was not digital detox, it was spiritual discipline. You think of indigenous rituals of retreat, vision quests, solitary journeys into wilderness, days of fasting, of silence, of waiting for dreams and visions. These too were acts of withdrawal, of stepping away from community in order to return with clarity, wisdom, perspective. Even philosophers practiced this. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, wrote to himself in his journal, a kind of private feed with only one reader, that solitude was necessary to remember what truly mattered. The Stoics spoke of withdrawing inward, of stepping back from the crowd's illusions. And in all these traditions, you see the same pattern. To step away from the noise is to confront yourself. To strip away distraction is to see what lies beneath. To endure silence is to discover what fills it. You realize then that quitting social media is not only a modern experiment. It is an ancient impulse dressed in new clothes. It is the same hunger for clarity that drove monks to monasteries, hermits to deserts, seekers to mountains. The difference is not in the impulse but in the medium. Where they fled cities and marketplaces, you flee feeds and timelines. Where they silence the voices of neighbors, you silence the voices of billions. Where they sought solitude in forests, you seek it in the quiet absence of apps. And so you are not alone in this. You are part of a lineage stretching across centuries of humans who have felt the need to step back, to slow down, to listen more deeply. But here is the paradox: they often returned. The monk may leave the monastery to teach. The hermit may return with wisdom to share. The seeker may bring back visions for the community. Withdrawal was rarely permanent. It was a rhythm: retreat then return, silence then speech, solitude then connection. Perhaps this too is what quitting social media will become. Not exile forever, but rhythm. Seasons of absence, seasons of presence. Retreat when the noise overwhelms, return when connection calls. Not purity, but balance. You feel the truth of this in your own body. After days of silence, you hunger for voices. After days of noise, you hunger for quiet. The cycle is not weakness, it is nature. And maybe the deeper wisdom is not to choose one forever, but to honor both. To know when to step back and when to step in. To learn the rhythm of your own attention, your own heart, your own need for solitude and connection. You think of how easily modern culture has forgotten this rhythm. How rare it is to have silence, to have boredom, to have time unfilled. How everything pushes toward constant presence, constant communication, constant performance. In that light, quitting is not only personal, it is revolutionary. It is the act of remembering something humanity once knew: that silence is necessary, that absence is fertile, that solitude is not empty but alive. And yet silence is not easy. You discover this quickly. The first days of absence are filled with restlessness. Your thoughts run wild, you crave distraction, you feel the itch in your hands, you feel the ghost vibrations of a phone that no longer pings. This is not unlike what monks described: the noonday demon, the restlessness of solitude, the urge to abandon the practice and return to noise. The discipline, then, is not to romanticize silence, but to endure it, to wait long enough for its gifts to emerge. Because silence does not give itself easily. It reveals itself slowly, like a landscape seen through fog. First the outlines, then the details, then the depth. And you begin to sense what they sensed, those monks and hermits and seekers. Silence is not empty, it is full. Full of your own thoughts, your own memories, your own fears, your own creativity. Silence is the mirror that shows you what noise was hiding. You remember the way boredom, once feared, begins to flower into creativity. The way loneliness, once sharp, begins to soften into solitude. The way absence, once painful, begins to open into presence. And you realize quitting social media is not just absence, it is practice. A practice of listening, a practice of waiting, a practice of being. But unlike the monks, you live in a world that does not honor silence. Your retreat is not in a monastery, but in a bedroom with Wi-Fi still humming in the walls. Your solitude is not in the desert, but in a city where everyone else is still scrolling. You are surrounded by the noise even as you step away from it. This makes the practice harder, but perhaps also more necessary. Because silence in this age is not given, it must be chosen, it must be protected. And so you begin to see quitting not as exile, but as craft. The craft of carving silence from noise, of making space in a crowded world, of practicing attention in a culture of distraction. You understand then why it feels both liberating and lonely, because you are doing something ancient, but in a context that does not understand it. You are carrying an old impulse into a new age, where silence is strange, where absence is suspect, where retreat is almost unthinkable. And maybe that is why the experiment matters. Not because it solves the problem of social media, but because it reminds you, and perhaps those who notice your absence, that silence still exists, that retreat is still possible, that solitude still has meaning. You are not the first to walk this path, you will not be the last. But in walking it now, in this moment of history, you join a long lineage of seekers, wanderers, monks, hermits, philosophers, humans who dared to ask the question, what happens when I step away? The answers they found were never final. The answers you find will never be final. But the act of asking, that is the thread that connects you across time. And so, as you lie in the quiet, phone still dark, you whisper the question once more, knowing it is both ancient and new. What happens when we quit social media? The silence answers not with resolution but with presence, and you feel for a moment part of something much larger. The silence has settled now. It is no longer raw, no longer a sharp contrast to the noise of before. It has become its own texture, its own background hum. And in that silence you begin to notice more than mood shifts, more than philosophical reflections. You begin to notice the brain itself adjusting. Because withdrawal is not only spiritual, not only cultural, it is neurological. You think of the restless itch you felt in the first days, the phantom vibrations, the impulse to reach for a device that no longer held the feed. That itch was not weakness, it was wiring. Years of repetition had carved grooves into your brain, neural pathways strengthened by constant reinforcement. Dopamine hits on every scroll, every like, every notification, the machinery of addiction. Neuroscientists have studied this. They've placed brains under fMRI scans, watched them light up when people receive digital notifications. The same areas glow as when gamblers pull slot machines or when smokers take a drag. The variable reward system, the unpredictable delivery of pleasure, is one of the most powerful motivators the brain knows. It rewires behavior, making you return not because you want to, but because you've been trained to. When you quit, those pathways don't vanish overnight. They fire like ghosts, urging you to check, to scroll, to seek. The absence feels unnatural not because silence is unnatural, but because the brain has been reshaped. The first phase of quitting, then, is neurological hunger, the mind reaching for sugar after years of sweetness. But slowly, with time, new pathways grow. The craving diminishes, the itch softens, other forms of reward begin to register again. A conversation, a book, a walk, the pleasure of unfragmented attention. The brain adapts, neuroplasticity works both ways. And in this adaptation, you begin to see another truth. Quitting social media is not only about recovering time, it is about recovering attention itself. Attention is not infinite, it is a resource, limited and precious. And social media is designed to harvest it, to fragment it, to monetize it. When you step away, you notice how much of your attention was scattered, pulled in dozens of directions, each interruption erasing the thread of your thought. Psychologists call this attention residue. Each time you switch tasks, some fragment of your focus lingers behind, cluttering your mind, slowing your return to depth. Social media, with its endless notifications and micro-distractions, creates constant residue. You are always partly elsewhere, partly waiting, partly fragmented. But in the silence of quitting, residue clears. You feel it when you read for an hour without interruption, when you write without glancing down, when you listen to someone without half your mind elsewhere. Depth returns, flow returns, the ability to sink fully into a task, to disappear into it, to feel time bend around you. And with it comes calm, because fragmentation is not only distracting, it is stressful. Each notification, each ping, each scroll is a tiny jolt of stress. The nervous system stays on edge, always alert, always waiting for the next hit. Cortisol rises, restlessness grows, anxiety builds. Quitting lowers the noise floor, the nervous system relaxes, your heart slows. Your body begins to relearn what it feels like not to be constantly interrupted, constantly pinged, constantly summoned. Sleep improves too, the science is clear on this. Blue light delays melatonin, yes, but so does arousal. The emotional stimulation of scrolling, envy, outrage, amusement, curiosity keeps the mind alert. It is not only light that keeps you awake. It is the flood of novelty, the rapid shifts in emotion, the endless sense of unfinishedness. Without it, your body returns to rhythm, sleep deepens, dreams grow more vivid, rest feels more complete. Memory strengthens. Without outsourcing to timelines and photo archives, your brain begins to store again. Psychologists studying digital amnesia find that people who rely heavily on devices remember less because the brain adapts to the expectation that information will always be stored elsewhere. But when you quit, recall sharpens, details stick. Life feels more textured, less like a blur. And perhaps most importantly, emotion steadies. Because social media amplifies extremes, it is built to reward engagement, and engagement is strongest when emotions spike. Outrage spreads, envy lingers, validation hooks. The result is a constant roller coaster, small highs, sharp lows, endless oscillation. Step away and the peaks and valleys flatten. Life feels calmer, less dramatic, yes, but steadier, more livable. This too has been measured. Studies show that heavy users report higher levels of anxiety and depression. Quitting, even briefly, reduces stress, increases well-being. The effect is not always dramatic, but it is consistent. The nervous system stabilizes, the emotional baseline rises. And yet you remind yourself none of this is simple, because the benefits are real, but so are the costs. The brain heals, but the heart sometimes aches. Focus returns, but loneliness grows. Depth strengthens, but connection thins. The science, after all, does not measure the ache of invisibility, the sting of missed jokes, the fear of being forgotten. It measures cortisol, melatonin, memory recall. It tells part of the story, but not the whole. And you feel the weight of that, because you know now that quitting is not a miracle cure. It is not an escape into purity. It is a shift in balance. You lose some wounds, you gain others. But still, the neuroscience matters, because it reminds you that much of what you felt before was not weakness, not failure, not lack of willpower. It was design, it was wiring. It was your brain responding as any brain would to systems built to capture it. And this realization is liberating because it shifts the frame. You are not broken for struggling to step away. The struggle is proof that the system works exactly as it was built to. Your choice to leave, however partial, however temporary, is not small. It is resistant. You let this sink in. You feel the calm of knowing your attention is not a flaw but a resource. You feel the strength of knowing your silence is not absence but presence. You feel the quiet satisfaction of knowing your brain, over time, can heal. And yet, even here in the calm, another question lingers. If these platforms shape the brain so powerfully, if they rewire attention, memory, emotion, what will happen to a generation that never steps away? What will happen to minds shaped entirely by the feed, never given silence, never allowed boredom, never taught depth? You cannot answer. You can only hold the question, let it echo in the silence, let it sharpen your awareness of the path you are walking. And as you close your eyes, the thought returns, steady as ever. What happens when we quit social media? The brain begins to heal, but the story is not finished. Without social media, you begin to face yourself more directly. It sounds obvious, almost trite. Of course you face yourself, you always live with yourself. But before, you were rarely alone. Your reflection was everywhere. Every time you posted, you glimpsed yourself through the eyes of others, their likes, their comments, their silence. Each reaction, each absence of reaction became a mirror. And over time, those mirrors shaped the way you thought about who you were. Now, the mirrors are gone. And it unsettles you, because identity, you realize, is not built only from within. It is built from without, shaped by the recognition of others, by the feedback of community, by the reflections that come when you are seen. Without those reflections, something shifts. You feel lighter in one way, free of judgment, free of comparison. But you also feel unmoored, like a figure without a shadow. Who are you when no one is watching? This question lingers quietly in the silence. At first, the absence feels like loss. You miss the affirmation, the gentle reinforcement of being noticed. You post a thought, a photo, a moment, someone reacts, and you feel a flicker of existence. Without it, you wonder, does this moment still matter? Does this thought still hold weight if no one sees it? The philosopher Charles Taylor once wrote about the politics of recognition, the idea that identity is formed through acknowledgement by others. To be unseen is to be diminished. To be ignored is to be erased. In this sense, social media intensified an ancient truth. Humans hunger to be seen, to be reflected back, to matter in the eyes of another. But there is another truth, older still. The self does not dissolve in silence, it grows. Without the constant mirror, you begin to hear your own voice more clearly. You write thoughts in a notebook unseen by others. You linger with them longer because they do not vanish into a feed. You take photos for yourself, not for likes. You notice beauty without the compulsion to capture it, to share it, to prove it. Slowly, you begin to disentangle the difference between who you are and how you are perceived. The gap is uncomfortable, but it is also liberating. You remember, perhaps faintly, what it was like before, when identity was shaped by smaller circles, family, friends, colleagues, when recognition came not in numbers but in faces, when being unseen by strangers was normal, not alarming. You realize how much your sense of self had expanded outward, stretched thin across thousands of eyes that barely knew you. And you feel in the silence the contraction, the narrowing, the return to a smaller scale. This narrowing is not always comfortable. It can feel like diminishment, like fading, but it can also feel like depth, like returning to your own shape. Psychologists studying self-esteem have found that social media often distorts it. The endless comparison, the curated selves, the quantifiable metrics of attention all erode the fragile balance of self-worth. Some thrive in it, yes, but many falter. Many come to measure their value not by their own sense of being, but by the shifting tides of likes and comments. When you quit, the metric dissolves. You no longer count yourself by numbers, and in that void something else must rise. For some, it is devastating. Without the mirror, without the constant reassurance, self-esteem plummets. They return not because they love the feed, but because they cannot bear the silence. For others, it is renewal. Without the mirror, they rebuild self-esteem from within, slowly, awkwardly, but more solidly. They find confidence in doing, not in being seen. They find worth in presence, not in performance. You begin to notice in yourself the fragile balance. Some days you miss the affirmation, other days you feel stronger without it. Some days the silence feels like invisibility, other days it feels like authenticity. The paradox persists. And yet, in that paradox, you begin to see a deeper layer of identity, the part not shaped by mirrors at all. Because beneath the self that craves recognition, there is a quieter self, the self that breathes without being watched, the self that notices beauty without posting it, the self that remembers without archiving, the self that exists fully whether or not anyone else sees. This self is harder to touch. It is buried under years of performance, under layers of reflection. But in the silence, it begins to stir. You catch glimpses of it when you walk alone and notice your own thoughts unspooling, not for anyone else's ears, but just for you. You feel it when you laugh at something in solitude, with no one to witness, no one to validate. You sense it when you feel joy, unrecorded, unshared, fleeting and private. This is not the identity built by recognition. It is the identity that simply is. And you begin to wonder, was this self always there, waiting? Or did it grow only in absence, only when the mirrors cracked? The question lingers, but perhaps the answer matters less than the awareness. Because once you glimpse this quieter self, you cannot forget it. You know it exists. You know you can live from it. You know your value does not have to depend on eyes, on numbers, on reflections. And yet you also know that you are human. That recognition is not weakness but need. That to be seen is part of being alive. That mirrors, though distorting, also confirm existence. So again, the paradox holds. You need both. The recognition of others and the recognition of yourself. The mirrors of community and the silence of solitude. Social media amplified one side until it drowned out the other. Quitting swings the pendulum back, but the balance is fragile, shifting. And perhaps that is the deeper task, not to eliminate mirrors, not to eliminate recognition, but to keep them in proportion. To remember that you exist in both directions, inward and outward, alone and together, seen and unseen. As you reflect on this, you recall a line from Walt Whitman, "I contain multitudes." You understand now that identity is not singular, it is layered. It shifts depending on who sees, who doesn't, who matters, who doesn't. The self is not one thing. It is many, unfolding, changing, shaped by mirrors and silences alike. And quitting social media is not about finding your true self, as if such a thing were singular and fixed. It is about shifting the balance, peeling away the dominance of external mirrors to rediscover the quieter selves that live beneath. This discovery does not end loneliness. It does not end the hunger to be seen, but it does offer perspective. It shows you that your being is not reducible to metrics. It shows you that your identity is not owned by algorithms. It shows you that you can exist in the absence of recognition, and that this existence, though quieter, is no less real. You lie in bed, phone still silent, the questions circling once more. What happens when we quit social media? The answer tonight is this: we meet ourselves again, not as reflection, but as presence. And in that meeting, we begin to remember who we are when no one is watching. You've explored what happens when one person steps away, but you begin to wonder what happens when many do. What happens when not just an individual but a community or even a culture chooses silence over noise, absence over performance, depth over the feed? Because identity is not only personal, it is collective. Groups, like individuals, live through recognition. They tell stories about themselves to themselves through whatever mediums they have. Once it was myth, then scripture, then books, then television. Now it is the feed. Think of movements, hashtags that catch fire, slogans that spread faster than wildflowers, images that circulate until they become symbols. These are not small things. They shape how we see ourselves as societies. They define generations. They turn moments into turning points. Think of nations. Leaders speak not only through speeches now, but through posts, tweets, live streams. Policies are tested in the waters of online reaction before they are written on paper. What a country is increasingly shaped in the collective imagination of feeds. Think of subcultures. Communities that once met in basements, in clubs, in hidden rooms, now gather in groups and threads. The queer teenager in a small town finds belonging in distant strangers. The hobbyist finds community in a niche group spread across continents. The lonely find recognition in a meme that tells them, "You are not alone." Social media, for all its chaos, has become the mirror in which groups recognize themselves. So what happens when groups step away? At first you might imagine it as loss. A movement without hashtags, slower, less visible. A nation without the instant pulse of citizen reaction. A subculture without a digital meeting ground, scattered, fragmented, harder to find. But you might also imagine it as freedom, a movement organizing in secret, away from the gaze of algorithms. A nation returning to slower discourse, less driven by outrage cycles. A subculture gathering in person again, or in quieter, less extractive spaces. It is difficult to picture because the feed has become so natural. But history reminds you, societies told stories long before servers. Cultures survived without timelines. Solutions spread without hashtags. Connection does not need algorithms. It needs only human beings speaking, listening, gathering. Still, something has changed. Because social media is not neutral, it does not simply reflect culture, it shapes it. It rewards speed over depth, spectacle over subtlety, outrage over nuance. It makes some voices louder and silences others. It spreads some truths and buries others. And in doing so, it shapes the collective imagination. When a group leaves, it steps outside that shaping. It risks invisibility, yes, but it also risks freedom. The freedom to tell stories differently, to imagine differently, to see itself without distortion. Imagine, for example, a community that decides to live without social media altogether. Perhaps a religious group, perhaps an intentional community, perhaps a town that simply grows weary of the noise. At first, they would be seen as odd, even backward. But within themselves, something might grow, a culture less dependent on constant performance, less fragmented by distraction, more rooted in direct presence. Or imagine a generation grown tired of being watched from birth, deciding en masse to abandon the feed. Imagine teenagers refusing the mirrors their parents accepted, building identity not through posts but through shared silence. Would they be invisible to the wider world? Perhaps. But within their own circles, might they find a different kind of authenticity? Perhaps. You realize then that the question of quitting is not only personal, it is political, it is cultural, because every absence is not only a silence, it is a refusal. Every step away is a challenge to the way attention has been captured, monetized, manipulated. This refusal need not be loud. In fact, it rarely is. It often looks like quiet choices. A family that decides dinners will be phone-free, a workplace that chooses slower communication, a friendship circle that commits to seeing each other face-to-face rather than only through posts. These are small acts, but together they reshape the culture of connection. And yet the cost is real. for marginalized groups, for movements without resources, for voices ignored by mainstream media. Social media has provided visibility that silence cannot. To step away collectively may mean surrendering that power. This is the paradox again, but on a larger scale. The feed is both lifeline and trap. It empowers and it exploits. It connects and it fragments. So what happens when groups quit? Perhaps they lose reach but gain depth. Perhaps they fade from the global conversation but grow stronger in local presence. Perhaps they lose speed but regain patience. The trade-off is the same, only magnified. Freedom and exile, clarity and invisibility. You think too of what happens if no one quits. If the feed continues to grow, to shape culture, to amplify certain voices, to define identity for whole nations and generations. What happens to democracy when attention is the currency? What happens to truth when virality outruns verification? What happens to culture when stories are told not for meaning but for engagement? These questions are larger than one person's silence, but your silence, your absence is still part of the answer, because culture is not made only by corporations. It is made by choices, small, daily, repeated. Each absence weakens the plaza just as each presence strengthens it. Perhaps the future will not be decided by a single revolution, but by countless small refusals. Families, friends, communities, towns, generations, all experimenting, all adjusting, all carving silence where noise once reigned. Or perhaps the future will be decided by those who never quit, who build deeper and deeper inside the feed, until it becomes not a platform but a reality itself. Perhaps absence will become impossible, like trying to live without roads, without electricity, without writing. You cannot know. But you do know this: every group, every culture, every nation is telling its story through these platforms now. And quitting, whether by one person or by many, is not only stepping away from distraction. It is stepping away from the very stage where collective identity is being written. That is the cost, that is the freedom. You close your eyes and see it clearly. Quitting is not only exile from the crowd, it is exile from the story the crowd is telling about itself. And yet in that exile new stories can form, smaller, quieter, less visible, but no less real. And maybe that is the lesson. That identity, whether personal or collective, does not live only in mirrors. It also lives in silence. It lives in the stories told face to face, in the memories not posted, in the bonds not quantified. So you whisper again, this time not only for yourself but for us all. What happens when we quit social media? The answer is not one thing. The answer is many things, unfolding in the lives of individuals, in the choices of communities, in the shape of cultures. And the story is still being written, line by line, silence by silence. You've thought about yourself, you've thought about friends, about communities, about nations, but your mind begins to drift further still, beyond the present, beyond what is already visible. What happens in the future? What kinds of societies will grow in the soil of constant feeds, and what kinds might grow in the silence of withdrawal? You imagine two paths, two futures that fork from this moment, neither pure, neither simple, but both vivid. In the first, the feed deepens. It grows more immersive, more seamless, until it is no longer something you open. It is something you live inside. Augmented reality glasses, contact lenses, neural links. The feed projected directly onto the world, layered over faces, over streets, over skies, no longer scrolling but inhabiting. In this future, the plaza never sleeps. You walk through a city and every building hums with reviews, comments, images. Every person you meet carries floating tags of their posts, their followers, their online presence. The mirror has expanded beyond the screen. It overlays reality itself. To quit in such a world would be near impossible, not because you lack willpower, but because absence itself would mean blindness. You would see only half of reality, the physical layer without the digital one. You would be invisible to others, not only in feeds but in daily life. To live without the feed would be to live like a ghost. This path feels chilling, but it also feels possible. Already the signs are here. the blending of digital and physical, the hunger for more connection, the drive toward immersion. But then you imagine the second path. In this one, the fatigue breaks. People grow weary of constant presence, constant mirrors, constant performance. The tide shifts. The young especially rebel. They choose slowness, privacy, silence. They build communities where phones are absent, where attention is sacred, where presence is face to face. The feeds do not vanish, but they shrink. They become utilities, not worlds, useful for certain functions, but no longer the center of identity. Life moves back into smaller circles, deeper bonds, slower rhythms. In this future, quitting is no longer exile. It is normal, it is respected. To be offline is not to be invisible, it is simply another way of living. This path feels fragile, but it too feels possible. Already you see whispers of it, movements for digital minimalism, retreats where devices are banned, young people fleeing mainstream platforms for smaller, quieter spaces. And perhaps the real future will be neither extreme but a tension between the two. Some will live inside the plaza fully immersed. Others will live at its edges, dipping in and out, choosing silence more often. The world will split not geographically but experientially, some inhabiting the feed as reality, others resisting it, creating parallel ways of being. You wonder how these two societies would see each other. Would the immersed view the silent as backward, primitive, cut off from the true flow of life? Would the silent view the immersed as lost, addicted, drowning in mirrors? Would there be tension, or would there be quiet coexistence, like two species inhabiting the same planet but breathing different air? You imagine generations too, parents immersed, children rebelling, parents silent, children diving into noise, the cycle repeating as cycles always do. One age craving connection, the next craving silence. One age intoxicated by novelty, the next aching for depth. The thought makes you smile, because history has always swung like this. Extremes followed by correction, abundance followed by restraint, noise followed by silence. But then another vision rises, one more unsettling. What if the ability to quit becomes a privilege? Already you see hints. Those with resources can afford to step away to protect their attention, to retreat into silence. They have the money for retreats, for slower lives, for communities where presence is valued. But those without resources remain tethered, dependent on platforms for work, for news, for community. For them, quitting is not liberation, it is exclusion. In this vision, the world splits not by choice, but by class. The wealthy curate silence. The poor are trapped in noise. The gap widens, not only economic, but cognitive, emotional, spiritual. And you realize the question of quitting is not only personal, not only cultural, not only historical. It is also political. Who gets to quit? Who has the freedom to step away? Who is forced to remain? The thought lingers heavy, because silence, though nourishing, is not equally accessible. To live without the feed requires alternatives, ways to work, to connect, to belong outside the plaza. Without those, silence becomes luxury. You wonder what kind of future this would create. A world where silence itself is privilege, where attention itself is wealth, where presence is unequally distributed. And suddenly, quitting does not feel like an isolated experiment at all. It feels like a question that cuts to the heart of justice, of equity, of how societies will divide in the decades ahead. You feel a tension rise in you. On one hand, the personal benefits are undeniable, the brain healing, the emotions steadying, the identity deepening. On the other, the collective risks are undeniable too, the loss of voices, the gap of privilege, the fragmentation of societies. And once again, you stand in paradox. Quitting is not salvation, staying is not ruin, both are both. Both heal, both wound, both free, both bind. The future, then, is not about choosing once and for all. It is about learning to live in the tension, collectively, just as you are learning individually. It is about acknowledging that social media is neither monster nor miracle. It is tool, trap, lifeline, mirror, amplifier. And the question is not whether we will escape it. The question is how we will live with it. You take a breath and let the possibilities unfold. Immersive feeds overlaying reality, mass retreats into silence, cycles of rebellion, divides of privilege. The visions swirl, none complete, none final. They are not predictions, they are reminders. Reminders that the story is still being written. Reminders that every choice, every absence, every silence is part of the writing. You whisper the question again, this time to the future itself. What happens when we quit social media? The answer perhaps is this: we alter the trajectory of the story. Not the whole story, not alone, but our part of it. And in that alteration, the future bends, however slightly. Days pass, weeks, enough time for the silence to stop feeling like silence at all. Enough time for absence to stop being noticeable. It becomes ordinary, natural. Life takes on a new rhythm, not dramatic, not cinematic, but steady. You wake in the morning and no longer feel the phantom urge to check. The hand no longer twitches toward the device before your eyes have fully opened. The space between sleep and waking belongs to you again. Those groggy moments of half-thought, half-dream, once crowded by notifications, now open, unclaimed. You lie still and let the day arrive slowly, like light seeping through curtains. Breakfast tastes different too, not because the food has changed, but because attention has. You notice the crunch of toast, the bitterness of coffee, the smell rising from steam. Before, these details blurred, drowned by scrolling. Now they stand out, textured, layered, alive. And in the stillness, you begin to rediscover the weight of time. Waiting, for example, feels different at the bus stop, in the grocery line, in the pause before someone arrives. Once these were gaps you rushed to fill, thumb scrolling, mind elsewhere. Now they are pauses you inhabit. You look around, you breathe. You feel the small awkwardness of doing nothing, then the relief of not needing to. It is strange at first. Boredom creeps in, sharp and itchy. But then boredom shifts, it stretches, it softens. It becomes a space where thoughts wander, old memories resurfacing, half-formed ideas taking shape. Sometimes you hum a tune you haven't thought of in years. Sometimes you imagine futures that have no audience, no witness, just yours. The pauses, once forgotten, become fertile again. Ships shift too, they are fewer but deeper. Without the constant drip of digital updates, you must reach out more deliberately. A call, a visit, a letter maybe, though letters feel archaic now. These acts take effort, but the effort makes them real. A conversation lasts longer than a comment thread. A meeting carries more weight than a like. You begin to see that the ease of social media was also its fragility. Easy bonds fray, harder bonds hold. You notice something subtle in yourself, a growing patience, not only with others but with life itself. The constant hunger for novelty weakens. You find yourself rereading books instead of skimming headlines. You linger with movies rather than half-watching while scrolling. You cook slowly. You walk without rushing. The world, once fragmented into flashes, begins to stretch into longer lines. Even your memory feels thicker. Days are not blurred by the sameness of scrolling. They feel distinct, like beads on a string. You remember Tuesday's walk because you noticed the way the light fell on the river. You remember Thursday's meal because you actually tasted it. Time stops collapsing into one endless feed of interchangeable moments. It becomes textured again, stitched with detail. Yet the ache of absence never vanishes entirely. Some evenings feel heavy with loneliness. You wonder what you are missing. You imagine the conversations still unfolding in the plaza, the jokes, the debates, the birthdays. You feel the gap between your life and theirs, as though you are on parallel tracks, close enough to sense but too far to join. The ache, though, grows gentler with time. It becomes less of a wound and more of a scar, a reminder of connection, not its absence. You carry it, but it no longer dominates. It becomes part of the rhythm. And in that rhythm, you notice something profound. Your life feels more yours, not because it is bigger or brighter, but because it is unshared. It exists without needing to be witnessed, without needing to be translated into performance. The small joys, the private frustrations, the fleeting moments, none of them have to be broadcast. They belong only to you. This is both liberating and unsettling, because for years you were taught that moments mattered more when seen, that a sunset was brighter if photographed, that a meal was tastier if posted, that laughter was louder if shared online. Now you relearn the opposite, that moments matter because you live them, not because anyone else does. And in this relearning, gratitude blooms, Not dramatic gratitude, not grand epiphanies, just small, steady appreciation, a breeze on your face, a quiet hour with a book, a walk home under streetlights, things once flattened by the noise of feeds now textured again. Still, the paradox remains. You have gained depth but lost reach. You are more present in your own life but less present in the lives of others. You know more about yourself but less about what your friends ate for lunch, what joke they shared, what article they reposted. Sometimes this feels like clarity, sometimes it feels like blindness. And maybe that is the truth. Living without social media is not purer, not cleaner. It is simply different. The gains and losses coexist, woven together. You cannot keep one without the other. You begin to see your life less as before and after and more as rhythm, silence and noise, presence and absence, alone and together. Sometimes you step back in briefly to see what's happening. Sometimes you step away again to breathe. The cycle feels natural, less like rebellion and more like balance. And you think maybe this is what it means to live now. Not to quit forever, not to drown forever, but to navigate, to know the cost of each choice, to choose deliberately rather than unconsciously, to hold the tension without needing to resolve it. You smile at the thought, because maybe the question was never, what happens when we quit social media? Maybe the question was always, what happens when we learn to live with it without letting it own us? But you don't answer, you let the thought drift. You know the answer shifts day by day, person by person. What matters is not the conclusion, what matters is the asking. And so, as you walk home one evening, your pocket quiet, your mind unfragmented, you let the question rise again. Not as demand, not as problem, but as companion. What happens when we quit social media? The silence answers not with certainty, but with presence. And for now, that is enough. You've lingered long in the personal, in the day-to-day textures of a quieter life. But now the question grows larger again, swelling beyond the individual. Because silence, while intimate, has consequences that ripple outward. And when enough people step away, something begins to shift in the larger world: art, culture, politics. You begin with art. Once art traveled slowly. A painting hung in a gallery, a book moved from hand to hand, a song was carried by word of mouth, by the scratch of a record. Attention was scarce, but depth was thick. Art lived in specific places, specific times. Now art lives in the feed. A photo, a song, a video, it can circle the world in minutes. Virality is not only possible, it is the expectation. Artists, young and old, shape their work to fit the format: short, striking, easily shared. The frame of the feed bends the shape of creativity itself. But what happens if enough people step away? If the feed loses its dominance even slightly? Perhaps art grows stranger again, less engineered for quick consumption, more willing to sprawl, to breathe, to confuse, to linger. Perhaps artists return to slower forms, knowing their audience is smaller but more attentive. Perhaps the culture of likes gives way to the culture of letters, conversations, gatherings. Perhaps virality weakens but intimacy strengthens. The trade-off is clear: reach versus depth. Without the feed, fewer eyes see the work, but those who do stay longer. They live with it, not just scroll past it. And art, you realize, has always lived at the tension between these poles: exposure and immersion, crowd and devotee. The feed tilted one way, absence tilts the other. Now you turn to culture more broadly. Culture is how a society tells itself who it is. It's the stories it repeats, the symbols it shares, the heroes it elevates. Social media has accelerated culture to a frantic pace. Memes that last a week, trends that last a day, outrage cycles that burn and vanish in hours. The collective imagination flickers, fractured, scattered. If more people quit, what happens? Culture slows, symbols endure longer, stories carry more weight, shared references are fewer but stronger. Instead of thousands of micro-trends, perhaps a handful of deeper currents emerge. Instead of outrage fading in hours, conversations might last weeks, months. Culture would not vanish, it would change its metabolism. But this too has risk. Slowness can mean stagnation. Without the constant churn, marginalized voices may struggle to break through, movements may take longer to rise, injustices may remain hidden. The plaza, for all its noise, amplifies the silenced. Without it, the silenced may be silenced again. And so once more the paradox holds. The plaza is both distortion and megaphone. To leave is both clarity and invisibility. Culture would gain depth but lose reach. Finally, you turn to politics. Here, the stakes are even sharper. Politics has always lived in stories, in symbols, in movements of attention. The printing press spread manifestos. Radio carried speeches. Television shaped debates. Now social media drives politics at unprecedented speed. Campaigns rise on hashtags. Policies are tested by memes. Outrage fuels movements before facts catch up. If more people quit, politics changes, it slows. It retreats into other spaces, town halls, newspapers, long-form discussions. Deliberation may deepen. Echo chambers may weaken. The fever of constant outrage may cool. But the danger is real. To step away is also to step out of the conversation. Those who remain in the feed would dominate the discourse. Silence is not neutral. It creates a vacuum that louder voices will fill. And so, again, the paradox. To stay is to be swept into cycles of outrage, manipulation, distraction. To leave is to risk irrelevance, to surrender the space to those who remain. You feel the weight of this more acutely now, because your personal choice, though intimate, is not isolated. It ripples into the larger story. If enough people step away, art shifts, culture shifts, politics shifts. The plaza shrinks, the garden expands, but the balance of power shifts too. Those who remain in the plaza grow louder. Those who retreat grow quieter. Perhaps the future is not about one path or the other, but about the tension between them. Some will stay, fighting in the plaza, shaping culture in its noisy square. Others will retreat, cultivating depth, building slower forms. The two will coexist, sometimes in conflict, sometimes in harmony. And maybe that is the healthiest outcome. A society with both speeds, a society with both spaces, a society where art can go viral in a night and also linger in quiet rooms for years. A society where politics can move quickly when needed, but also pause for deliberation. A society where culture flickers with memes and also deepens with rituals. You imagine this balance and feel a strange peace, because perhaps the real danger was never social media itself, but forgetting alternatives existed. Leaving the plaza was the only space. Leaving virality was the only form of art. Leaving outrage was the only form of politics. Quitting then, even by a few, is not about dismantling the plaza. It is about reminding us the garden still exists, that other tempos are possible, that culture does not have to move only at the speed of the feed. And as you sit with this, you feel again the rhythm that has run through all of this journey, paradox. Every gain shadows a loss. Every loss shadows a gain. To quit is to free yourself and to exile yourself. To stay is to connect and to fragment. Both are true, both will remain true. So you whisper the question again, this time stretched across art, culture, politics. What happens when we quit social media? The answer is not simple. The answer is not final. The answer is an ongoing story written in the choices of individuals, communities, generations. And the story, like all stories, is not finished. You've thought about art, about culture, about politics, but your mind drifts further still, beyond societies, beyond generations, toward the scale of centuries. Because what you are experimenting with now, this simple act of absence, may not be trivial at all. It may be part of a larger pattern, one that could bend human evolution itself. Evolution is not only about bodies. It is about minds. Brains change when environments change. Attention rewires when the world demands new rhythms. Memory adapts when storage is externalized. Identity reshapes when mirrors multiply. And now, in this age, the environment of the mind is unlike anything it has ever been. Billions of humans connected in constant, restless exchange. If this becomes permanent, what will we become? You imagine the path where social media, or whatever follows it, remains central. 1,000 years from now, attention itself may have shortened beyond recognition. Brains may evolve to process fragments, flashes, endless streams of novelty. Memory may shrink further, outsourced completely to archives. The self may be defined almost entirely by mirrors, entity not as inner presence, but as constant performance. Perhaps our descendants will no longer even find depth natural. Long stretches of silence, sustained focus, solitary thought, these might feel alien, impossible. The human mind may become a hummingbird, darting endlessly, never resting, surviving on nectar of novelty. This is one future, and if it comes, quitting may look quaint, like a romantic attempt to preserve something that evolution itself has left behind. But then you imagine another path. What if fatigue breaks the cycle? What if, in centuries to come, the mind rebels against its own overstimulation? What if humans as a species rediscover silence, not as nostalgia but as necessity? Perhaps those who learn to carve out quiet, who cultivate depth, will thrive in ways the restless cannot. Perhaps attention itself will become a new form of survival, a new kind of evolutionary advantage. In this path, quitting is not quaint, it is prophetic, a foreshadow of where the species must go to survive its own inventions. And maybe the truth will lie, as always, between the two. Some will evolve into hummingbirds, some will evolve into owls. The species will split not by body but by mind, different rhythms of attention, different ways of being human. The thought unsettles you, because it suggests that what feels like a personal experiment is, in some way, part of a larger trajectory, a small note in the long music of evolution. You think about time itself. Before clocks, before calendars, time was felt in rhythms, sunrise, sunset, seasons. Then came mechanical time, carving the day into hours, minutes, seconds. Industrial time with its schedules, its shifts, its relentless pace. Now digital time, fragmented, continuous, every second filled with updates, notifications, refreshes. Quitting, you realize, is not only about silence. It is about reclaiming older forms of time. It is about stepping out of digital time back into natural rhythms. When you quit, you feel days lengthen again, moments stretch, seasons matter. This shift, if widespread, could reshape how humans experience life itself. Imagine a world where silence becomes ritual again, where generations carve out days without devices, not as rebellion but as rhythm, where cultures reintroduce boredom as a practice, attention as a discipline, solitude as a sacred act. Would that not change us as much as agriculture changed us, as literacy changed us, as industry changed us? Because every great transformation of humanity has been tied to attention. Agriculture tied it to cycles of growth, literacy tied it to symbols on a page, industry tied it to machines, now social media ties it to the feed. Each shift reshaped our brains, our memories, our societies. Each shift created new humans, new selves. And perhaps the act of quitting, even by some, even by few, is a countershift, a small resistance, a reminder that attention need not be fully captured, that silence is still possible, that another form of humanity can still exist. You think of children again, not only what they are becoming now, but what they may become across generations. If they grow up never knowing silence, their brains will adapt to noise. If they grow up taught to protect silence, their brains will adapt to depth. The choice of today shapes the mind of tomorrow. This is not abstract. Epigenetics shows that experiences alter biology, that stress, attention, environment ripple into the body, passed on in subtle ways. The silence you cultivate may echo beyond you, may shape not only your life but the lives of those who come after. The thought humbles you, because it makes clear that quitting is not only personal, not only cultural, not only political, it is evolutionary. It is about what kind of humans will exist in the future. And perhaps the question shifts, grows wider. What happens to humanity if we never quit? Do we become restless shadows, endlessly performing, endlessly distracted, never still enough to hear our own thoughts? Or do we adapt, evolve, thrive in the chaos, building new forms of creativity, new forms of connection, new ways of being that our slower ancestors could not imagine? You cannot know, but you do know this: quitting, even briefly, allows you to see the stakes. It allows you to step outside, to glimpse what is being lost, what is being gained, what is being reshaped. It gives you perspective, the ability to see that the way we live now is not inevitable, not eternal. It is only one stage in the long evolution of attention, and maybe that is enough. not to halt the tide, not to predict the future, but to witness the moment, to see it clearly, to live in it consciously. You close your eyes and imagine the far future, hummingbirds and owls, noise and silence, feeds and gardens. Both possibilities alive, both woven into the fabric of humanity. And you whisper again, stretching across centuries, what happens when we quit social media? The answer is not just personal, it is evolutionary. It shapes what we as a species may become. And that answer, like all others, remains open, unresolved, waiting in the silence of tomorrow. You've thought about the brain, you've thought about culture, you've stretched your imagination across centuries. But the truth is, most of life unfolds not in evolution, not in history, not in politics, but in the quiet folds of human intimacy, love, friendship, connection. And here, quitting social media may be felt most sharply. At first, it feels like absence. The easy bonds of online life vanish. No more heart emojis under your partner's photo. No more casual check-ins through stories or status updates. No more silent witness to each other's daily fragments. You wonder, does the relationship weaken without those threads? Do friendships fray when the digital stitching is cut? In some ways, yes. Without the feed, you know less about the surface of people's lives. You miss the small updates, the lunch, the pet photo, the quick thought shared in passing. These things, trivial on their own, create texture in a relationship. They remind you that someone is there, alive, moving through their days. Without them, the silence can feel wide. But something else emerges too. The relationships that remain are thicker, denser, more deliberate. Instead of scattering fragments of yourself across 100 eyes, you give more presence to the few who remain. A conversation lasts longer than a comment. A letter carries more weight than a like. A visit becomes not background noise but an event. This shift reshapes intimacy. Consider romantic love. In the feed, couples often exist partly as performance. Photos, captions, anniversaries broadcast to the world. A relationship is curated, not only lived. And though this can feel affirming, it also creates subtle pressure to look happy, to appear solid, to match the script of public affection. When you quit, that layer dissolves. Love becomes less visible but more private. You are no longer measured by how many likes your couple photo receives or how many comments mark your anniversary. Your bond exists only between you in the unseen hours, in the daily gestures that no one else notices. This privacy can feel like loss, no audience, no affirmation, but it can also feel like protection. Love, unperformed, is harder to compare. It breathes in its own rhythm, not in the rhythm of the crowd. Friendship too changes. Without social media, you cannot maintain 100 loose ties. You must choose, you must reach out intentionally, you must risk silence if you do not. The wide net shrinks to a closer circle, and though you lose reach, you gain depth. You know less about many, more about a few. You trade breadth for intimacy. Even family shifts. Grandparents, siblings, cousins who once kept in touch through updates now require effort, calls, visits, deliberate attention. Some threads fade, others grow stronger. The family map redraws itself around effort, not algorithms. And perhaps the most subtle change is in how you see yourself in relation to others. Because social media does not only connect, it compares. Every relationship, every friendship, every love is reflected against others. How happy they seem, how close they look, how often they post. You measure your bonds against curated fragments and doubt creeps in. Without the mirror, comparison weakens. You no longer weigh your relationship against 1,000 others. You live it as it is without as many shadows. This can be frightening. It removes the reassurance of external affirmation. But it can also be freeing. It removes the pressure to match others. Intimacy in absence becomes more fragile, but also more real. There is another dimension too, loneliness. Because social media, for all its distortions, offers constant companionship. The sense that someone somewhere is listening. The feed is a crowd you can step into at any moment, even at midnight, even in despair. Without it, loneliness can feel sharper. Nights stretch longer, silences feel heavier. But here lies the paradox again. The very presence that numbs loneliness also prevents you from confronting it. The crowd is constant but shallow. The companionship is real but thin. When you quit, loneliness deepens, but it also clarifies. You feel it more acutely, but in feeling it, you begin to understand it. You begin to see what you truly need, not distraction, but presence, not performance, but connection. And this, perhaps, is where intimacy grows. In confronting loneliness, you reach more deliberately for others. You call a friend, you invite someone to dinner, you risk vulnerability because distraction is no longer enough. Relationships deepen not because they are easy, but because they are necessary. This necessity, this deliberate reaching, reshapes love. It strips away the illusion of constant connection and reveals the truth. Intimacy has always required effort, presence, risk. Social media softened that truth but also diluted it. Quitting sharpens it again. And you begin to see that absence does not kill intimacy, it refines it. It shows you which bonds are strong enough to endure without constant reinforcement, and which were fragile performances of connection. It hurts, yes, when some ties fade, but it also clarifies, revealing which threads are woven deeply enough to last. You think of an old friend you have not seen in years. Without social media, you would not know what they had for breakfast or what they posted last week. But when you call, when you meet, the conversation flows rich and alive. This is intimacy without fragments, depth without surface. It survives because it matters, not because an algorithm keeps it alive. And you think of another friend, one you used to like each other's posts, exchange small jokes in comments, share fragments in passing. Without the feed, the thread fades. You do not reach out, they do not either. The friendship dissolves, revealed as shallow. This hurts, but it also reveals truth. Not every bond is meant to last. Love, friendship, family all change when you quit. They become fewer, slower, more deliberate. They require effort, but they reward it. They lose performance, but gain privacy. They lose breadth, but gain depth. And once again, the paradox. Because sometimes you miss the surface, the ease, the constant small affirmations. Sometimes you wish for the noise, the crowd, the effortless companionship. Sometimes silence feels too sharp. But sometimes, too, you feel the opposite. The relief of intimacy unmeasured, the joy of friendship unperformed, the weight of love unbroadcast. You whisper the question again, this time from within your closest bonds. What happens when we quit social media? The answer tonight is this: intimacy shifts. It shrinks, it thickens, it becomes more deliberate, more fragile, more real. And perhaps in that fragility, it becomes more precious. You've wandered through silence, through loneliness, through intimacy. You've seen how relationships shift when the mirrors of the feed are gone. But underneath all of this, another question stirs, one older, deeper, harder to name. What happens to meaning itself when you quit social media? What happens to that ancient, restless human hunger for transcendence, for something beyond the self, when the noise is stripped away? Because whether or not you call it spirituality, religion, philosophy, or simply wonder, there has always been this search. Humans have always reached for something larger: gods, stars, nature, art. And in the age of social media, much of that hunger has been absorbed into the feed. Think of it. For many, the feed became a place of ritual, the morning scroll, the evening refresh, a place of testimony, confessions written into posts, affirmations shared, grief and joy declared publicly, a place of belief, causes taken up, identities proclaimed, battles fought, all carrying the fervor of faith. The feed, in its own way, became a temple. But it is a strange temple, one without silence, without depth, without mystery. A temple built not for transcendence, but for engagement. One where awe is flattened into spectacle, where wonder is cut into fragments, where transcendence is measured in likes. When you quit, you step out of this temple, and at first you feel its absence like a wound. Where is the sense of belonging? Where is the echo of voices rising in unison, the digital chorus that gave weight to your words, your beliefs, your causes? But slowly you realize, stepping away is not only exile, it is return. Turn to older forms of meaning. You notice it first in nature. A walk becomes more than exercise. Without the distraction of screens, you begin to see the subtle shifts, the way light bends through leaves, the slow rhythm of clouds, the hush of wind at dusk. These things, once background, become presence, and presence itself begins to feel sacred. You notice it in silence, At first, it is restless, itchy. But then, in longer stretches, silence deepens. You hear your own breath. You hear thoughts unspooling, no longer fragmented by constant interruption. And in those thoughts, sometimes something larger stirs, not answers, but questions, the kind that stretch beyond daily life into the vastness of existence itself. You notice it in rituals of slowness, cooking without distraction, reading without skimming, sitting with a candle, with tea, with nothing but time. These moments, stripped of performance, begin to feel like small acts of reverence. And you notice it in wonder, not curated wonder, no viral video of a sunset, no sped-up footage of the stars, but real wonder lived in the body. You stand at a river and feel its patience. You look at the night sky and feel its silence. You realize that awe does not need to be shared to be real. This is spirituality without feed, not religion necessarily, though it may overlap, not ideology necessarily, though it may echo. It is presence itself, experienced without performance. And it feels both fragile and profound. Fragile because it is so easily drowned by noise. One notification, one scroll, and the thread snaps. Profound because it reminds you of something the feed cannot give, that transcendence is not external. It is not in the crowd, it is in attention. You think of monks, of hermits, of seekers again. They stepped away not only to escape distraction, but to touch something larger. Silence was not emptiness, it was doorway. And you wonder, could quitting social media be a kind of modern monasticism? Not cloistered in stone walls, but cloistered in silence of choice. Not chanting psalms, but listening to breath, to wind, to your own unfragmented thoughts. You are not alone in this wondering. Already there are whispers of digital Sabbaths, of intentional disconnection framed as ritual, retreats where devices are banned, where silence is cultivated as sacred, movements calling for attention as the ultimate form of devotion, not to gods necessarily, but to life itself. You realize then that quitting is not only about productivity, not only about mental health, not only about relationships, it is also about meaning, about whether life is lived at the speed of noise or the rhythm of silence, about whether awe is outsourced or experienced directly, about whether transcendence is simulated or felt. The feed, for all its color, rarely allows awe. It offers constant novelty, but novelty is not wonder. Wonder requires space. Wonder requires stillness. Wonder requires the slow unfolding of time. Quitting then becomes an invitation, not only to heal attention, not only to deepen intimacy, but to rediscover awe. To remember that life itself, lived quietly, can be sacred. You feel it in small ways, the weight of a hand held without distraction, the warmth of light at dawn, the silence of a room where no device hums, the laughter of a friend heard fully without interruption. These moments, unshared, unposted, carry a gravity that the feed could never replicate. And you realize, perhaps the greatest risk of social media was not only distraction, not only addiction, but the slow erosion of wonder, the replacement of transcendence with spectacle, the flattening of awe into content. When you quit, wonder returns, not in grand epiphanies, but in quiet layers, revealed slowly, like the stars that emerge one by one in the night sky. You whisper the question again, this time like a prayer. What happens when we quit social media? And tonight the answer feels larger than you, meaning shifts, or returns, presence becomes sacred again. It is not easy, it is not constant. The silence still aches, the loneliness still lingers. But beneath it all there is something steadier, older, deeper, an echo of what humans have always known, that transcendence lives not in noise but in attention. And maybe, just maybe, quitting is not only personal healing, maybe it is spiritual practice, a way of remembering what was never gone, only hidden. The silence does not answer in words, it answers in presence, and for now that is enough. You've thought about silence as healing, you've thought about absence as clarity, you've touched on awe, on meaning, on the sacred hidden inside ordinary days. But another question waits in the shadows, one that social media itself has made impossible to avoid. What does it mean to be remembered when you no longer live? The feed has become a kind of graveyard, though no one wants to call it that. Profiles of the dead remain online, their photos frozen, their posts preserved, their birthdays still surfacing as reminders. You've seen it, friends gone, yet their account still alive, still gathering comments, still receiving digital flowers on anniversaries. A strange half-life, a ghost of presence. Social media changed how humans die. Once, memory lived in stories told at gatherings, in photos tucked into boxes, in names written on stones. Now memory lives in servers, in archives, in feeds that do not decay. Death has become searchable. Mourning has become public. Legacy has become quantifiable. Followers, posts, views, likes. But what happens when you quit? You step outside this new afterlife. You strip yourself of the archive that might one day remain. Your legacy shrinks to the older forms. Words spoken, gestures remembered, traces left in the lives of those who knew you. You will not linger as a profile waiting for visitors. You will vanish in time as humans always did before. At first, this thought chills you, because part of the lure of the feed was always this: permanence. The sense that your life, your moments, your images, your thoughts would survive floating forever in digital space. To quit is to surrender that permanence, to return to fragility, to admit that memory will fade. But then, slowly, you begin to see the beauty in this fragility. Because permanence, you realize, is illusion. Servers fail, forms collapse, accounts are deleted. What feels eternal is fragile too. And in chasing permanence, you risk forgetting the true scale of human life. It is brief, it is fragile, it is precious precisely because it ends. To quit is to remember this. To remember that your legacy is not in archives but in presence, not in posts but in moments, not in numbers but in the way you made someone feel, in the way your laughter echoed, in the way your kindness lingered. And perhaps in this, quitting brings you closer to the truth of mortality. Because death is not something the feed lets you feel. It softens it, makes it digital, makes it scrollable. You can visit the profile of the dead as if they were still alive. You can post to their page as if they could hear. This comforts, but it also blurs the reality. They are gone. In silence, death feels sharper. There is no archive to visit, no digital ghost to commune with. The absence is real, unsoftened. And in that sharpness, grief deepens, but so does presence. You love more fiercely when you know the moment cannot be replayed. You hold more gently when you know the memory will fade. You live more fully when you know nothing is guaranteed to remain. This is not easy, it is not comforting, but it is real. And in reality, perhaps there is grace. You think of legacy again. Without the feed, how will you be remembered? Perhaps only in the stories people tell, in the fragments of memory they carry, in the traces you leave on their lives. And perhaps this is enough, more than enough. Because those memories, though fragile, are alive. They breathe in the telling, they change, they grow, they fade. They are not static archives, they are living echoes. You realize then that legacy is not about being remembered by everyone. It is about being remembered by someone, not about lasting forever, about lasting long enough to matter. And maybe quitting is a way of accepting this, a way of letting go of the illusion of permanence. A way of embracing the fragile beauty of being human, here then gone, remembered for a while, then fading into silence. You think of time again, not just in days and seasons, but in centuries. Most humans are forgotten within 2 or 3 generations. Their names vanish, their stories dissolve. Even the famous, even the powerful eventually fade. Entire civilizations have risen and fallen, their monuments crumbled, their archives dust. Why should you be different? Social media tried to fight this truth. It promised a kind of immortality, but it was an illusion. And maybe, just maybe, letting go of that illusion is a kind of freedom. Because when you stop worrying about how you will be remembered, you can start living more fully in how you are present. When you stop curating an archive for the future, you can start inhabiting the moment. When you stop measuring legacy in likes, you can start measuring it in love. And maybe this is the paradox of quitting. It makes your mortality sharper, but it also makes your life richer. It strips away the dream of being remembered by strangers and returns you to the truth of being remembered by friends. It takes away the permanence of archives and returns you to the fragility of memory. It erases the illusion of immortality and returns you to the sacredness of impermanence. You whisper the question again, now tinged with mortality. What happens when we quit social media? The answer tonight is this: we remember that we are mortal. We remember that our lives are fragile. We remember that legacy is not in servers but in souls. And perhaps in remembering this, we begin to live more honestly. The silence deepens around you. You think of your own life, your own legacy, your own fragile moments. And you wonder not how you will be remembered, but how you will live here now in the brief time you are given. The feed cannot answer this, only silence can. You have walked a long path, from the first restless itch of absence to the quiet rhythms of ordinary days, from the shifting of friendships to the softening of loneliness, from the intimacy of love unperformed to the awe of silence rediscovered, from the fragility of legacy to the vast arc of human evolution. The question has followed you all the way, like a companion. What happens when we quit social media? You know now that the answer is not one thing, it is not a cure, it is not a ruin, it is not salvation, it is not exile, it is paradox, it is rhythm, it is both and neither. When you quit, the brain begins to heal. Attention thickens, sleep deepens, memory strengthens. But when you quit, loneliness sharpens. You miss the crowd, the chatter, the easy bonds. When you quit, intimacy deepens. Friendships grow slower but truer. Love grows less performed but more private. But when you quit, you lose reach. Some ties fray. Some bonds dissolve. When you quit, culture slows. Art grows stranger, deeper. Politics breathes more, deliberates more. But when you quit, you risk silence. You step out of the plaza and the plaza moves on without you. When you quit, awe returns. Silence becomes sacred. Presence feels alive again. But when you quit, mortality grows sharper. You feel the fragility of memory, the truth of impermanence. The paradox remains at every scale: personal, cultural, spiritual, evolutionary. Quitting is never only gain or loss, it is both. And the task is not to solve the paradox, but to live inside it, awake. You see now that the feed is not only distraction, it is not only noise. It is also a mirror, a stage, a megaphone, a temple. It distorts, but it also reveals. It connects, but it also fragments. It gives presence, but it also erodes it. And quitting is not only refusal, it is not only absence, it is also practice, ritual, discipline. It is a way of remembering that silence still exists, that attention can still belong to you, that meaning does not have to be measured, archived, performed. Perhaps this is the gift, not certainty, not resolution, but remembrance. Quitting reminds you that alternatives exist, that the plaza is not the only home, that the garden is still there, waiting, quiet, alive. And maybe that is enough. You think of the monks again, the hermits, the seekers. They stepped away not because the crowd was evil, but because silence was necessary. They withdrew not forever, but for a time. Retreat, then return. Silence, then speech. The rhythm of human life. Perhaps quitting social media is simply the modern form of this rhythm. A new kind of retreat, a new kind of silence. A way of remembering what humans have always needed: space, depth, or presence. You smile at the thought because it means you are not alone. You are part of a lineage stretching across centuries, across cultures, across civilization. Humans have always stepped away, always returned, always carried the paradox of connection and solitude. And now, in this noisy age, you carry it too. You close your eyes and the silence around you feels less like emptiness and more like presence. You listen to your breath, to the faint hum of night, to the small sounds that were always there but rarely heard. You feel the room cradle you, soft, steady. You think of the feed, not with anger, not with longing, but with recognition. It is there, still humming, still flowing, billions of voices speaking at once. And you are here, quiet, breathing, alive. Both are true, both exist. The feed does not vanish when you quit, but neither does silence vanish when you join. The choice is not all or nothing. The choice is rhythm, balance, awareness. You whisper the question one last time, as though to the night itself. What happens when we quit social media? The answer comes not as words, but as quiet. Not as certainty, but as presence. Not as resolution, but as wonder. And you realize the question was never meant to be closed. It was always meant to remain open, to linger, to echo, to guide. Because the point is not to solve it. The point is to live with it, to carry it, to let it shape the way you move through silence and noise, presence and absence, solitude and connection. You drift towards sleep with this awareness, your body softening, your thoughts loosening. The question follows you, gentle, steady, alive. Not finished, not answered, but present, and in its presence you find rest.